Yeah, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's David Mellor. I'm an Associate Lecturer at the Emergency Planning College, and this is the third in what will be a series of webinars on topical issues run by the Emergency Planning College. I'm going to cover a presentation in around 30 minutes or so using the PowerPoint you'll see on the screen. And at the end of the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for questions. We'll just need to unmute and then open it up for questions. And then another method of communication is to use the chat box on your screen, but just make sure that you select send to all panelists so that any comments or observations you have either during the PowerPoint presentation or during the Q&A session afterwards can be seen by us all. Okay, so I'll get underway then. Today's issue is around managing the special and distinct needs of children and young people in emergencies and disasters. And my central proposition is that in the UK we pay insufficient attention to the needs of children and young people in our national plans for managing emergencies, for responding to recovering from emergencies, and at a local level I don't think there is sufficient coordination. Okay, so that's my central proposition, which I'll now try and convince you of as we work through this presentation. Okay, an image there from the Boxing Day tsunami. So let's start with the international picture. And as you can see from this slide here, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was published back now in 1989, states the pretty obvious and straightforward point that children, because of their vulnerability, need special care and assistance. UNICEF go on to take the view that children today will bear a disproportionate share of the disaster impacts of climate change, both in the immediate and the longer term. And they've calculated that the number of children a year affected by disasters has now risen to 175 million worldwide, compared to an estimate of around 66.5 million children per year affected by disasters back in the 1990s. So that's almost a tripling of the impact of disasters on children over 10 to 15 years. And we know that in emergencies and disasters there is a higher mortality rate for children and young people, and also a higher morbidity rate. That's morbidity means the incidence of disease during and after extreme events. And if we look once again at the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, the largest number of fatalities were amongst women and children under the age of 15. And in some areas affected by that disaster, up to 4 times as many women died as men. And in many cases this was because their efforts to save their children slowed down their flight. So very significant impact on children and women in emergencies and disasters worldwide. And considerable research on the impact of disasters and emergencies on children. And first point is that children generally lack the capacity to fully manage their own needs, full stop. But in emergency situations, this is even more pronounced. And maybe in the UK, the research which suggests our overprotective approach to children, reducing their ability to assess and manage risks for themselves, by parental overprotectiveness, perhaps that impacts upon that even further. As a result of emergencies, the research tells us that children can suffer disproportionately and as a result fall behind their peers. And the physical and psychological damage sustained by children can far outweigh the effects on adults and require substantial physical, psychological and other therapy over many years to address the impact. So, given the impact of disasters and emergencies on children and young people, and given the extent to which children and young people are suffering disproportionately the impacts of climate change, you would think that children will be at the heart of what we do in the UK to prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergencies. Okay, that's a question I'm going to leave hanging there for the moment, so we can just hold off answering it until we've just looked at a couple of case studies, which I'll move into now. Okay, it's a nice image from one of the many floods that we've suffered in the UK in recent years. Looks quite a jolly adventure, really, isn't it? Those two boys in their dinghy in the flood water. I'll show my age and say it could be an image from Just William or something like that. But lurking in that water are a number of dangers. What does that flood water contain? It'll contain sewerage, disease, and any number of hazards. So let's look at the first case study in the UK, and that's the swine flu pandemic. Still very clear in our memories from back in 2009. I'm picking out the swine flu pandemic because children and the needs of children and young people were very, very prominent in that outbreak. First of all, children were very prominent amongst those worst affected, possibly because of their lack of residual immunity from previous exposure to similar viruses. Children were seen as super spreaders of the virus. You'll recall the news bulletins as the impact of swine flu started to grow exponentially and the number of cases started to grow exponentially week on week. And it was directly linked to the behaviour of school children, the school term dates, etc. And children were seen as super spreaders because they tend to shed more virus than adults, and they're less likely to follow rigorous hand and respiratory hygiene measures, more likely to be in close physical contact with each other through play. And schools were very much part of that early attempt to try and contain the spread of the pandemic, with schools where infections were reported being closed for a period to prevent the super spreaders doing their work, to try and put a brake on the spread. And you'll also recall that antivirals were prescribed to healthy children as a preventative measure in the early days of the pandemic until adverse side effects were noted in otherwise healthy children. And children were, as I say, amongst the worst affected. In Northern Ireland, there were several deaths amongst children attending schools for severe learning disability, for example, and the high dependency beds for children were under significant pressure. So the point of mentioning the swine flu pandemic is to say that flagged up for us that the needs of children and young people can be subtly, in this case, significantly different than those for adults in emergencies. Okay, second case study, the Carlisle floods in 2005. This is an image we use often in our lectures and courses at the Emergency Planning College. It's from the Carlisle floods. It's to demonstrate the lack of resilience of Carlisle Council when that flood hit. That's the city council's headquarters, and where are the computer servers placed and located? That's right, they're in the basement, and so completely flooded out. And there's some poor IT geek being airlifted by helicopter onto the roof of the council headquarters, not quite sure what his or her instructions are. Perhaps it's to unplug the servers and plug them back in. Again, I'm not sure. But that's the classic image we use of the Carlisle floods. But a very serious flooding episode, heavy rainfall on the 7th of January 2005, led to 3 rivers bursting their banks, 1,700 homes were flooded, 3 people were killed, thousands of lives disrupted. And whilst 50% of those who were evacuated from their homes returned within 9 months, some 20 to 30 families were out of their homes for 24 months. And I just ask you to pause for a moment and think about what was happening in those 20 or 30 families and the stress that they might be experiencing whilst they're out of their homes. Think about the emotional and physical health impacts of being in temporary accommodation for that length of time, the impact on the well-being of the insecurity and uncertainty of it. Those sort of impacts of emergencies are often referred to as the shadow impacts, the things we don't necessarily see so clearly, the things which are affecting people's lives but which don't feature in the official statistics. For example, following the foot and mouth outbreak in 2001 in the UK, there was a spike in suicides in the agricultural communities, which didn't feature in many of the statistics about the foot and mouth outbreak. So shadow impacts can be just as severe as the most obvious impacts of 1,700 homes flooded, etc. Now, one aspect of the Carlisle floods was the impact on children. Many children were evacuated from their homes. Many more were unable to return to their schools. Some of them lost coursework and vital revision notes in the floods. And of course, for many of these children, not only had they got these very unusual stresses caused by the floods, but they were going through the usual stresses and strains of being a teenager, worrying about various aspects of their life, their relationships, and preparing for exams. And then suddenly their world is torn apart by the floods. And it's worthy of note that many schools where pupils have been really adversely affected by the floods applied for special dispensations to the various exam boards, but there's no reports of any special dispensations being granted. Now, it's my case, it's my belief, that the indifference of the examination boards to the impact of the floods on these Carlisle school children is symptomatic of a marked lack of focus on the distinct and special needs of children in emergencies and disasters. Okay, so that's 2 quick case studies to make some initial points. Let's now just look generally at emergency management in the UK, where we are less affected and better prepared than most countries in the world. But it's a fact that the frequency and severity of extreme weather events are likely to increase, and the data suggests that they have been increasing significantly over the last 10 years, with flood and storm incidents increasing by about 7% year on year. And we've only got to just look at what's been happening over the last 2 or 3 weeks, as we've seen really severe flooding across various parts of the country. So the Carlisle floods of 2005, clearly not an isolated example. And disasters elsewhere can have profound effects on us in the UK. Chernobyl, the meltdown of the nuclear reactor in Russia, in the Ukraine rather, in 1985, 1986. There's still 300 farms in the UK with restrictions placed on them. The Boxing Day tsunami I mentioned earlier, 155 UK nationals dead in that disaster. And our interconnected world ensures the very efficient delivery of infections such as swine flu, as I've mentioned, but SARS and bird flu to the UK. Okay, just thinking about how emergencies are managed in the UK. This is the concept which underpins emergency management in the UK, 2 A's, 2 P's and 2 R's. I guess many of the people signed up to this webinar will be familiar with this concept, others less so. But as you can see, it's a circular process whereby we anticipate new threats, like cyber terrorism, for example, as a new threat, assess it, look at ways in which we might prevent it, prepare for the outbreak or incidents of the particular emergency or disaster. Swine flu, for example, the pandemic was something that we put exhaustive preparations in place for. And then there's the response to the emergency, followed by the recovery phase. And it's during the response and the recovery phase where children and young people are likely to be particularly vulnerable, particularly where there's dislocation in their lives, where services are disrupted, where they're potentially evacuated, where they have to move in with family or friends, where there's a different family composition which might increase the risks to them. And during the recovery phase, normal services may be disrupted for a very long time indeed. Okay, still looking at UK approaches to emergencies and disasters. We've got a very, very well-researched and up-to-date suite of documents which guide us through emergency management in the UK. The first one is Emergency Preparedness, which is the UK guidance on the pre-emergency phase. I'm just looking at this document first of all, and there's very little said, very little written in this document about children. They're identified as vulnerable, but on the single ground of dependence, no other grounds. Children's social care departments in local authorities are asked to draw up plans to support survivors. Any volunteers who might be required to work with children should be vetted. And there's a tip, a very good tip, that children can be a very, very effective conduit for messages back to their adult family members, which is supported by research. Okay, so very substantial document setting out how we should prepare as a country, as local areas to prepare for emergencies, assess risks, etc. And those are the few small mentions of the needs of children and young people in preparedness. I would say that's pretty insubstantial. Moving on now to emergency response and recovery. This is a massive tome which runs to 349 pages, but devotes only 4 paragraphs to children. We've got a repeat final bullet point on this slide of the need to ensure that those working with children are properly vetted. So that's repeated. There's a recommendation that support services should be considered and provided for children who experience any trauma in emergencies or disasters. There's a need identified to provide accurate and timely information to children, and also the need to debrief children on their experiences in an emergency or disaster to assist them in coming to terms with it and eventually being rehabilitated where that is necessary. That's almost it in this 349-page tome. There is also reference to a guide to handling crises in schools, which is entitled Wise Before the Event, Coping with Crises in Schools, which is an absolutely smashing little book. It describes how crises can affect schools, how their impact can be reduced, and goes on to advocate the development of a school contingency plan. But It was written in 1993 and it's not yet been updated. So it takes no account of more recent critical events that have affected schools, such as the murder of the head teacher Philip Lawrence, the Dunblane massacre, the attack on the nursery in Wolverhampton in which Lisa Potts heroically protected her children, but 6 of them were attacked with a machete as she was. And of course there have been several international incidents, the various shootings in schools and colleges in North America, the awful siege and hostage taking at the Beslan school, and so on and so forth. So this key document, which acts as guidance to school, omits all of that learning from the last 20 years. And if we just think about the Dunblane massacre, the inquiry chaired by Lord Cullen led to significant changes in relating to the security of schools, but as I say, not reflected in this guidance. And that's it. So emergency response and recovery, 4 mentions plus a reference to a very valuable but actually seriously out of date document providing guidance to schools. Moving on then to the third limb of our national guidance to prepare us for emergencies and disasters, and that's a focus on community resilience, which is a relatively recent approach which works on the assumption that communities, properly informed, properly supported, with access to accurate and timely information, can take the necessary steps to look after themselves. And this guidance, much of which has been written in the last couple of years, includes just one reference to children, to families with children actually, who are identified as one of 2 groups of vulnerable people. You'll be interested to know that the other 2 groups of vulnerable people identified in the guidance are the elderly, which grossly understates vulnerability in the community, omitting any mention of disability or vulnerability due to mental illness, for example. So, back to the question I posed a few minutes ago. Children are at the heart of what we do in the UK to prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergencies. Right? Well, no, I'm saying it's wrong. It's my personal view that the national plans that I've just had a quick gallop through, in terms of identifying and addressing the special and distinct needs of children and young people, and we saw how special and distinct they can be in the swine flu pandemic in 2009, what I'm saying is that these documents are not fit for purpose. Okay, so let's move away from, we've looked at the international picture, we've looked at the national picture, let's have a look at what's happening locally. And here what I'm seeing is a tale of 2 worlds. That's the emergency planning world, which some of those signed up to the webinar will exist in, and the safeguarding children world, which again some of those signed up to the webinar will exist in. And the question I'm asking is how well connected those 2 worlds are. Okay, so I'll just spend a couple of minutes just just describing those 2 worlds in a bit of detail in case you occupy one world and not the other. So let's look first of all locally at the emergency planning world. We've got 43 local resilience forums, or LRFs, across England and Wales, which correspond with the England and Wales police forces. And their job is to prepare for emergencies, so to maintain effective arrangements for ultimately responding to major emergencies. They have a statutory basis. The Civil Contingencies Act 2004 is the particular legislation which places a number of statutory duties on those agencies which are regarded as Category 1 responders, which include the local authority, National Health Service, the Police Service, Fire and Rescue Service, ambulance service, etc. And those duties include obvious duties, such as the duty to cooperate, to share information, to warn and inform the public, and to assess risks and publicise those risks so that the community is better informed about the risks they face. And in the event of an emergency taking place, there are tried and tested structures in place to coordinate the activities of the responders in the event of an emergency. And in the event of a really major emergency which threatens to overwhelm normal services in a local area, a strategic coordinating group, or SCG, will be set up to coordinate activity. Okay, so that's the emergency planning world. Just moving on briefly to the safeguarding children world. Safeguarding is a term which I don't think is widely understood. It includes child protection, protecting children from harm, but it's wider than that. It includes also early intervention to try and prevent harm escalating to the level where it's necessary for children's services, statutory services, to become involved. And in this country, most children and young people are kept perfectly safe by their parents, their carers, and by universal services such as schools, GPs, early years settings such as nurseries, etc., with more specialised services being available as needs escalate, such as local authority children's services I've mentioned, CAMS, that's children and adolescent mental health services. And across England and Wales, we've got 168 local safeguarding children boards, pretty much all independently chaired. I'm the independent chair of a local safeguarding children board in Stockport in Greater Manchester. And our job as a local safeguarding children board, as in the other 167 LSCBs across the country, is to ensure that arrangements for keeping children and young people safe in the local area are both effective and well coordinated. And again, like the arrangements for preparing for emergencies, it has the force of law, it's on a statutory basis under the Children's Act, and it's a multi-agency partnership, including many of the same partner agencies who are members of the Local Resilience Forum. That's a local authority, children's services, youth offending services, the health service, GPs, accidents and emergencies, health visitors, etc., the police, and a range of other agencies, including the voluntary sector. And if a crisis occurs, and crises do occur in the local safeguarding children world, then a serious case review will be commissioned in cases, for example, where a child died or suffered significant harm and abuse or neglect were present. And some of these serious case reviews can lead to full-blown crises. Perhaps you'll remember the baby P death in Haringey, and more recently the child sexual exploitation cases in Rochdale, which can lead to a great deal of media attention, a great deal of reputational damage to the area. So some similarities with the way in which emergencies can turn into crises as well. So do the worlds have much in common? That's the emergency management world locally and the safeguarding children world. Well, I think they do. They've both got huge agendas. Both are managing high levels of risk. There are dire consequences if things go wrong. If agencies don't plan effectively to handle emergencies and people suffer as a result. If safeguarding arrangements are not effective and children suffer, then dire consequences can result. Both are underpinned by law and statutory guidance. Both worlds have similar core members. And I would say they both have a common goal of preventing harm to vulnerable people. In the case of the safeguarding children world, that's children and young people. In the case of the emergency planning world, that's everyone who could be considered to be vulnerable. So they've got a lot in common, I would say, but do they talk to each other? The answer is yes, but there's some brilliant links on particular issues, such as engagement with schools. There's been some really good work done in schools where obviously children and young people spend the majority of their time. Fantastic case study I came across with Essex schools, where 2,000 pupils aged between 6 and 11 engaged in a highly interactive way in trying to understand the risks posed to them in emergencies and work out what to do with them. And that example was really carefully evaluated, and they found that 59% of children who'd been involved in the project had then involved their families in the work, which emphasises the point which I made earlier about children being a terribly effective conduit for information about emergency planning back to their families. Crucial crew, amazing multi-agency days when the emergency services and others put on highly interactive days for school children to experience scenarios and learn more about managing the risks they might face. But my experience in Greater Manchester certainly is that these really effective crucial crew arrangements are coming under considerable pressure as a result of the economic cutbacks. So some examples of good practice. There's a legal duty on the part of the local resilience forums to share information with others. But it's my experience that the strategic partnerships locally, that's the local resilience forum and the local Safeguarding Children board, don't appear to communicate with each other. I've been an independent chair of the Safeguarding Children board in Stockport for 2.5 years, and before that 2.5 years in Cheshire East. And the needs of children and young people in emergencies have not featured on the agendas of either of those boards at all during those lengthy periods of time. That may be because local Safeguarding Children boards have not got their troubles to seek with serious case reviews and challenges such as child sexual exploitation. But it's interesting that emergency management has not featured on the agenda of local Safeguarding Children boards. I don't know whether in any of the areas which you work in there's a closer relationship between local resilience forums and local Safeguarding Children boards, but in my area there doesn't seem to be much communication between them. Well, so what? Does it matter that these two worlds operate largely independently of each other? Well, the answer is yes, it does matter, because in an emergency, the structures and systems which keep children safe can be seriously disrupted. The system for safeguarding children over which my board presides in Stockport is extraordinarily complicated, with a whole range of agencies and services having to work in quite a connected and joined up way. It's also under considerable strain, with huge numbers of referrals to children's services, and all of the agencies involved are having to make cutbacks and redesign services. So the system is under strain anyway. In an emergency or a disaster, it will be further disrupted. Many Safeguarding Children boards cover areas, obviously, which are particularly susceptible to the effects of extreme weather, where flooding occurs time and again. And in those areas, is guidance available on how to safeguard children in the event of emergencies? Well, I just did a quick check of some websites of Safeguarding Children boards in areas of the country which are more prone to severe weather emergencies than others, and all of the websites for Safeguarding Children boards contain policies and procedures to guide local professionals, but on none of the websites did I find any evidence of guidance on how to safeguard children in emergencies. And just going back to Carlisle again, 20 to 30 families out of their homes for 24 months. This would put pressure on any family. But what if those families had pre-existing issues around domestic abuse, parental substance misuse, or mental health? It seems likely that any pre-existing problems in the family would be exacerbated under such pressures. Okay, so I'm moving towards the close of the presentation now, I think there is scope for a shared agenda between the emergency management worlds and the local safeguarding board worlds. Joint training is a potential possibility because training breaks down barriers, enables people to share ideas. And certainly in the emergency planning world, there's regular exercising and testing of arrangements in which the LSCB could be a part. The LSCB could quality assure emergency plans to ensure they're sufficiently child-focused. And looking at good practice internationally, the USA Red Cross published guidance entitled Helping Children Cope with Disasters, where they recommend the Children's Issues Coordinator should be appointed for the duration of an emergency or disaster to track and advocate for the needs of children throughout emergencies. Explicit reference is made to child protection in emergency management guidance published by UNICEF. That is not the case here. The UNICEF guidance starts with the principle that whatever we do in response to an emergency, it should do no harm. The do no harm principle means that you avoid environmental degradation, you avoid excessive mortality and morbidity amongst girls, boys and women, and there's, as I say, an explicit reference to the need to protect children and young people. There's no such reference in our national planning guidance for emergencies at all. And UNICEF take the view that plans need to take account of the special needs of children. Save the Children also published guidance in 2007 entitled A Guide for the Inclusion of Children in Emergency Operation Plans. They're talking about engaging children in planning for emergencies. And good practice needs to be more readily available. I mentioned the good practice of the Essex schools, but it took some scouring through pages of good practice on the UK Resilience website to find it. I think we need to gather good practice about managing the needs of children in emergencies and make it more readily available. Okay, so in a moment I'm just going to be asking you for any ideas, but just to finish on a rather serious and somber note, those of us who are involved in the safeguarding children field will be able to immediately mention the names of children and young people who've tragically died in the past and whose deaths have led to significant changes in policies. I mentioned Baby P, Peter Connolly. Victoria Climbier is another name that immediately springs to mind. Wouldn't it be better to try and recognise the issue of children and young people in disasters and do something about it rather than waiting for a tragedy to occur? And the final point I'd make is that if arrangements for managing emergencies in the UK aren't sufficiently child-focused, then it's just possible the risk of children might inadvertently be increased as a result of that oversight.